Today is November 23rd, 2022. My name is Gina Matos, and I'm interviewing Roman Jasmine on behalf of the Houston Asian American Archive. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to conduct an interview with me.
Yeah, you're welcome anytime.
Okay, so we can go ahead and get into the first question. When and where were you born?
I was born February 18th, 1969 in the city of Angeles City, which is in the Philippines, next to Clark Air Force Base, to give you some reference.
What were your parents' occupations?
Well, my father was U.S., he was in the Air Force, enlisted as a sergeant. My mom was a homemaker, so she basically just stays home, take care of kids.
So growing up with a father who was a sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, how did this affect your childhood?
Oh, basically what happened is that we keep on moving around a lot. So therefore, having bonds and relationships with other kids was hard, not only for me and my brothers and sister, but also with other kids as well, being in a military family, because usually you stay in a station for 2 years and then you move to another location, sometimes mid school year. So unfortunate, but that's what happens. That's what the military requires. Um, so it was more like really a drag because you can't build social relationships that way. But you stay close with your family and so forth. So at least you have that.
Speaking of being close with family, you grew up with 5 siblings?
Actually, three siblings.
3 siblings.
Two of them, I don't know what happened to them, but I do know that they exist. And parents are in my family, there are secrets that, don't get revealed until probably later on when some unfortunate older relative and older passed away and news starts coming in. It's like, oh, this happened or that happened. Secrets happen that way. So two of my siblings, I don't know the fate of, but my older sister, she's the oldest one. She moved out when she turned 18 and got married. So that means only me and my two other brothers. So growing up and we're the ones that moved around while the others. My older sister, she stayed in Manila, Philippines with her family, and the other two, I don't know, but me and my brothers are the only one. So it's fun. You build relationships that way and stay cohesive as a family.
I see. Going off of that, how would you describe the household you grew up in, apart from moving around a lot? Are there any specific memories you would like to share?
Oh, it's a typical life otherwise, other than the move. If we and being in the military, and one thing that we're probably going to touch off later on is that my family, the Jasmines, have been in the military since during the Second World War, and from that, our family environment is more military styled, disciplined. My father always who is not harsh, but he did treat the order and the strictness of rules, enforcement of rules, and so forth. So it's that kind of environment. It was not harsh, but it's more focused on discipline and being responsible, caring for others, and focusing on the family, and also have some spiritual beliefs at the same time. Those are the common values, and obviously the golden rules of be nice to one another, everything you learn from the Bible, and respect of elders and traditions and culture. So um, wherever we go, there's always a different culture that we must learn, and then also the languages. So that needed to be done if it wasn't, if English and the Western culture was not predominant in that, country, then we had to learn how to ingest it as kids because that's what they do in our schools. Oh, another thing too, they made us go to military schools, base schools, not outside schools. So just to clarify. So again, more discipline, more not harshness, but more structure. So it helps build character that way. And being in a military family, if any of the kids become rowdy, rude, or rebellious, and it takes it out on, the environment, like graffiti, like a building, or rebel or cause riots and stuff like that, it reflects more on the parents, the military parents. So that's why my parents, my military parents, had to be strict on their kids, and that helps in their upbringing and character development.
Did you practice any particular Filipino traditions with your family growing up?
You know, my family, my father and my mother, they're like second generation, Americans, Filipino Americans, but we also have different cultures as well, not necessarily Filipino, but more Chinese, more Vietnamese, and many other different, So in order to answer your question, I have to like think back really, what was really a Filipino tradition, what was really American only tradition, because we did celebrate Halloween, we did celebrate, some of the Filipino holidays as well when my mom remembers, or my parents remembers, um, you know, Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas. So it's hard for me thinking back quickly what was truly a Western and what was not Western. So yeah, that's the best answer I could give for that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you moved from Okinawa to the Philippines in grade school.
Yeah.
Uh, do you remember experiencing any sort of particular culture shock at such a young age? And if you could elaborate on how it was growing up in the Philippines.
Okay, first of all, there was, since we're more base centered or base restricted because of my parents wanted it that way, um, really couldn't see what's outside the other side of the wall and the other side of the fence. We were in Kadena, we were inside the base. So the Japanese slash Okinawan culture really didn't get that much of it other than, the anime and also the toy stores and stuff like that when we go outside the base. But inside the base, it's more um, westernized based, and that kind of structure. When we moved to the Philippines, same thing, except for this time we live off base, and even then, the subdivision or the area that we were living in had a bunch of other off base base families. So one area could be off base, but predominantly is still a sense of being on base still, but we're not on base. So the environment is still the same, even though we're in different locations. There is no cultural change, but there is always like a cultural teacher that teaches the kids their culture and traditions and also the languages of the countries that one is based in, like Japanese for when you're in Okinawa, and then Filipino for when you're in the Philippines. Um, did not have any cultural shock because, as I said, we've been moving around a lot, so therefore don't know exactly what is American versus what is Korean or whatever is Filipino, whatever is Japanese. Wherever we were, we always thought, the way that we behaved, the celebrations and the holidays was something that we, it was part of us. So therefore, it's nothing new. So no culture shock that way.
Such an interesting answer. Reading from your biography, joining the Boy Scouts in grade school seems to not only have been a significant part of your childhood, but it had a role in sparking an interest in STEM for you. So can you elaborate on the beginnings of your interest in STEM?
Well, basically, it started out, about, because when I was in Okinawa, we were in Okinawa, a lot of our cartoons or things that we watch in TV were, and, Japanese robot movies, whatever it may be. So there was an interest of robots, first from a science fiction point of view and science fiction type technology, whatever, Star Trek, whatever, Godzilla. So that was established. And when I was in the Boy Scouts, I always wanted to do a lot of activities to earn badges. That's what they want you to do, and get that sense of goal, or be goal oriented and take the steps for that. Now, how that relates to my interest in science is because, no matter what I studied, it became more interesting. Some of the scientific subjects became interesting to me. Math become interesting to me. Um, Basic physics, basic science principles. You know, my science teachers always made it very interesting, talking about magnets and so forth. So it was my teachers, it was doing the Boy Scout projects, and particularly they are doing like a project on atomic energy. So I found that very interesting, and for somehow that more than anything else sparked a great interest to learn more when I was 11, and then focus more on my time that way, and to look at the future as to what's going on, what do I want to be, so forth. That determine that at an early age, what steps I want to take. So it's a gradual thing that got me interested into becoming where I am right now. Where I'm right now is more like into programming, and I'm still also on my off times. I do like a lot of scientific or computing or programming type of interest or reading up on. So stays with me. It's been in there from the very beginning, simply from just watching anime and then like looking at the science fiction side of it. So that got me interested in the fact that I understand it quickly. That's what another thing that got me interested, because a lot of other things, that people, you know, are doing, it's hard for me to like pick up and stuff like that. But when it comes to reading about science, reading about history of engineering, reading about anything technical, I picked it up quickly, even though if at an early age. So that made me feel that this is where I'm supposed to belong. So
Would you say that were there any specific school subjects that you disliked growing up?
no, actually, sense of curiosity, sense of structure, sense of um, I cannot think of any subject, whether it be grade school, middle school, junior high, even high school, that I did not like. Um, I do perform better on math or science, probably better than, probably composition or home ec or driving education. Uh, so is more like a pull to uh, heavy stuff, heavy subjects like science or math that got me interested, or even learning another language. You know, those were some of the subjects I rate myself as being higher on, and more in the lower end is more like language or even fine arts. You know, so yeah, there's nothing that that I did not dislike. It's more like on the style of the teacher and the mood of the environment, that determines not necessarily the subject matter, but more like if I want to be in that class because the teacher shows leadership, he shows or she or she shows like you know brings the interest or to bring that spark to the kids. And it's the kids' responsibility to just sit there and learn as much as they can. Um, I don't know. I digress. I I all right. Pretty much that's it. It's like I didn't have any any classes I didn't like.
Did your parents encourage academic discipline growing up, or would you say it was more self-instilled or a combination of both?
It's self-instilled. In fact, when in my teenage years, I was in junior high. I was studying a lot, going to the library a lot more than my peers, even when I was in summer school. My parents wanted me to not stop studying, do something else. And so therefore I did the Boy Scouts, I did soccer and basketball and so forth. A way to get out of the house. I do a lot of reading at that time, you know, reading books that were, age appropriate and, something I could digest at my age and my understanding. Um, Even when I was in high school, there was never a push from my Asian parents to like, excel. I wanted to excel for myself. No, I didn't want to do it because my uh, parents made me do it or they choose a direction for me, or a set of values. I learned it through watching them, through going to church, to my studies, through my teachers, and that's really important. It's like the teachers, the family, yes, those are the ones that build the foundations for your character. And, again, spiritual life as well, it comes into that, into your building your character. So yeah, in answer to your question, now they didn't. In fact, they wanted me to just do the opposite, meaning stop studying, go outside, be more sociable and stuff. I mean, I do that. I already had friends, and I was not a nerd. I was not outcast or isolated. In fact, a lot of people know who I was, even though they don't talk to me. Here's Roman, that's his name, and he does this, but he also studies and he also does Boy Scouts. He's in the science club. He knows all the smart people as well as the jocks, and people in this high level of the social ladder in high school and also junior high. So initially it was like academics, but eventually it becomes more well-rounded. I became more well-rounded because that's the way to do. That's the way to like survive and develop.
We will return to your academics in a bit when we talk about
Okay.
your university experience, but I wanted to go back to talking about immigrating to the US.
Okay.
Since you had already experienced moving across countries and to multiple different places with your family, was moving to America much of a change for you? And if so, how?
It was not. The only change was the distance traveling from one place to another place. All the other countries were smaller than the United States, but we moved to California and traveling from one area of one part of California to the other part of California took hours, which we were not used to. where we used to like 3 hours. That's the maximum to travel from one place to another place in Okinawa, Philippines. It's we always again 3 hours from any point, any distance, in a 3 hour driving radius. Culture was not surprising. There was no cultural shock. It was more like, are we there yet? Are we you know how soon before we get to our next place? It's more of that shock than anything else. So the people were less disciplined, because they're not raised in the base. So when you go off base in California, a lot of people's bad habits was noticed, as opposed to base school children, and base personnel or base families. So therefore that could be contribute to that could also be considered a uh, a cultural shock, because we, especially me, believe that since we've been staying in the base, in having that environment growing up, we naturally assume it happens in all families, but not all families are in the military. Not all families are disciplined. So when we check other you know when I check other when I started going to off base schools, not base schools, it was a shocker, because the kids that were not in the military or military families, their rudeness and also their behavior was odd. Because for us, if we did something like that as being base kids, we'll get in trouble, or our parents will get into trouble. So basically, we become good kids. But when I met the other kids who weren't grown up in the same military environment, their behavior is more lax or rude or uncontrolled or non-disciplined. So um, that was a big shocker. I mean, it shows in their social skills. It shows on their grades. Even though you know no one of none of our parents actually push us, but base kids actually excel really well, because that's the expectation, and not that many actually fail. But when I looked at my off-base friends who did not grow up in the military or had that military life upbringing, I see a lot of where troublesome behavior patterns, and also flaw in their character or lack of performance and so forth. So military life helps me and get me that structure.
Did you or any of your siblings ever clash with your father in terms of adapting or living the sort of military lifestyle, in which you mentioned can be more strict, etc.?
You're asking if you ask if we rebelled against the strictness or the structure of military life. No, because me and my brothers, while we were little, always believed, this is the way that we have to live, and we, as kids, we follow our parents, and this is how our parents behave. There's hierarchy, there's order. You say yes sir, yes ma'am, and you be truthful about it, and you always excel, because that's what expected, even though they don't, do anything upright. So I do not believe for myself that I rebelled, because of the military strictness. But I do know that my older brother, and your mom can actually, hear stories. He and his friends actually usually get in trouble, even though we're in a military family. But me and my little brother tend to be following the rules, living by the standards and so forth. So yeah, this me and my little brother were okay, but my older brother, I guess it's because he is the oldest, or he's not the oldest, but he's the oldest among the three siblings. So desire to rebel and be with the being hanging out with the wrong crowd actually cause some clashes, with my parents, especially.
Speaking of your siblings, did having siblings make things easier moving around so much?
Yes, growing up, you take your siblings for granted. You don't think, oh, they're a big pain in the butt. But if you could just imagine and role play in your head, if they were not there, it's only you and your two parents, and you're moving around and not developing, bonds with other kids. Yes, they are very important. And me, I'm important to them as well because, of the same situation or same reason. So there's a sense of, you know, thankfulness that they're in our lives and that they help us and keep us stable, and as opposed to if we're just only a, only child and stuff. But um, I came to realize that they were important. They give some support, even though officially outside, I was complaining about them being a pain. But inside, I think I really do appreciate them. Uh, both of them actually. So
Real quick, returning back to moving to the States, I
yes.
wanted to ask, what was your family's view or your view of America upon arrival or even before arriving?
That is, answer to that question is more like we were always instilled, influenced by our family that coming to America is very, very important. The country is very beautiful. It's a great place to be. And growing up, I could speak with for my siblings as well as like we all wanted to go to the United States and stay there rather than continually moving around from country to country. Uh, so when we finally arrived to the United States in, San Francisco and also Los Angeles, we were excited. Um, uh, but the culture did not surprise us because we're already used to it already. As I mentioned already, it's the hygiene and also the behavior of some of the people or the kids shocked us, but the culture did not. So we have that. I mean, we were happy to be there, but we were not. Finally, when we moved to Georgia Air Force Base, as we realized it's the middle of nowhere, it's a desert, and we thought that California was lush green paradise all throughout, but not every place was like that in California. So yeah, but we were happy, we're excited. It's like the promised land and also and a place where we should be. We will be happy in.
Thank you. We're gonna move more into your college experience now.
Okay.
First, how would you describe your experience at USC?
Uh, I was really excited from inside. For a long time, I wanted to go to college, but I had to go pass. I have to pass junior high. I had to graduate from high school. Then I could go to college. But I was itching, just like coming to the United States, I was itching to get to that place, come to the United States and going to college. And that might seems really odd to you for a small little kid, but you know, kids always have their dreams, and my dream was to grow up and experience college life and see what it has to offer, and also on that to be sort of independent and focus on my career as well, being a science slash engineer of sorts. Though I didn't know exactly what I wanted to be in that field, but I wanted to be in that field. So college life was interesting. A lot of new experiences. As I told you, I don't think I told you, but Victorville is the middle of nowhere. So socially, we can't do anything. But Los Angeles, we could do a lot more, within arm's reach. We don't have probably need to have a car. We could just use the bus. There's also so many different opportunities. So a lot of excitement for my first year being in college. So meet new friends that that stays with me, and also come from different backgrounds. you know since we were in a very good school, since I was going to a good school, the level of students and the level of people that I will be meeting and socializing with will have a specific standard, specific quality. So I was really happy about that. So that's what made me proud of, being in the, University of California, because of the caliber of the students that are being admitted, and, they're very studious. They, do a lot. They have a lot of culture for sports, and also other things like dancing, and also theology, and so many other, things uh, that I was really interested in. But I already know, even then, I already know what I wanted to be, which field I wanted to be in, what I must do in order to get there, and so forth. So I was set. I just need to like go through the programs and then graduate, and continue my career forward from there. So yeah.
You touched on this briefly, but you first pursued engineering classes, but then you decided to pursue a career in computer science. So I wanted to ask what particularly led to this decision.
Uh, well, uh, just a choice again. Basically, when it came to computer science, it's more like sitting in front of a computer terminal, making applications and seeing progress in, what you're doing. So, but with engineering, you need to have a lot of planning, a lot of calculations and so forth. For me, the reason why I choose computer science, because, one of the things I learned is that I love puzzles. I love, you know, board games that require strategy or thinking, planning ahead of time. At the same time, have measurable results. Engineering takes a while. You need to do a lot of calculations. You need to do a lot of planning. But you do the same thing in computer science, but it's more, the turnaround is much faster. You do a few, you learn the language, you apply the requirements, and then you just run you run your program. That is what I liked. So you didn't, we're still doing the same thing, but the turnaround is like much, much faster for computer science. That's why, I focus on that as well. And there was a time where I also focused on mathematics because, you know, again, the turnaround is faster. The blow, there's the same thing as planning, thinking, understanding, and then that aspect as well. But I wanted something that could be universally used in anything, like probably for cars, for programs, for banking, and other applications. So that's why I then again focus on computer science.
Moving forward a little bit, you mentioned having to drop out before graduation. What
Yes.
was your experience like during this time?
Well, finances, because what happened there is more like as you, uh, at that time, as you progress into becoming a junior or senior, the financial aid packages for a financial office switch. So now they are only offering more loans as opposed to grants. When you started, it was like an inverse pyramid. It's like there are more grants and scholarships and less, loans. So what happened there is like I was starting to get burnt out with, learning a lot, doing a lot of things, and trying to make the grades. At the same time, I had to consider the financial aspect of it. Do I want to graduate knowing that I had a bunch of loans that are monstrous at that time? So it was better, to leave and probably come back, probably, I don't know how long, and finish up my degree. Well, at the same, in the meantime, use the skills that I do have. And there was a lot of opportunities. I mean, short term, but probably didn't pay that much at that time because I still didn't have a degree with me. So I started applying to, opportunities at that time. Also around that time, there was the dot-com boom. Uh, if you have, during that time, if you have an idea and you could set up a business, and the internet was booming at that time as well. So you could set up a business online and provide services. And if you know a little bit, that that'll get you into the door so that you could know more and build your skill sets that way. So that's what I did for like close to 10 years. Then after 10 years, I just went back to school online and finished it up. And it was much cheaper and didn't take me long because I was only missing like 1 year before graduating. But I was able to gain experience, which is important, as well as getting the degree. Uh, so I felt well balanced. I felt, it might be a drawback, but at the same time, it gives me a sense of being independent financially as well as stable, rather than uh, leaving school and graduating with a piece of paper and then having lots of loans or having a big loan amount and trying to figure out what to where my how I'm going to pay that off and so forth. So I think out of all the possibilities, I think this was a good move. And to top it off, I did got my my degree online. So everything works out in the end. So it started out bad, but it turned out good in the end.
That's great to hear everything worked out.
Yeah, it was
Um,
long. There was, there are times where uh, the companies that was or the projects I was working on, they'll fold because it was coming to that point where dot-com bust, close to 2000. So it was getting harder and harder to find new jobs, even with the skill sets I have. So eventually, there was always, teaching abroad, being part of the Peace Corps, and they'll help, at least with the Peace Corps, if you serve for 2 years, you get, you after the 2 years, you get all your loans and also all your debts taken care of, school related. So I wanted to teach, so see what it's like. So therefore, um, temporarily became a teacher slash school teacher overseas, teaching English.
we will get into teaching in South Korea in just a bit. I
Okay.
had a few more questions about your career.
Okay.
So to clarify, would you say that working in computer science during the emergence of the internet had its ups and downs? It seems like that was the case from how you've explained it so far.
Yes. There was ups and downs. There was a lot of business business and companies that were still trying to establish their business models. And without a business model, it could, a business model determines your fate or your prosperity in whatever field. And it was pretty new, because a lot of companies were used to the brick and mortar building type of environment, but this is online. It's online services. So it's pretty new at that time, in that period. So people are still trying to figure out the best practices because no one really did know. Big companies didn't really know. So it was a new experience for everybody. So that's where the ups and downs, like what works, what didn't work. People are still trying to figure it out. And since I was a lowly programmer with no college degree, I just had to do the best I can with the products I do have and, make the company more successful so that eventually they'll last long enough to figure out what's the best model for the environment right now. How can we profit in this environment? So it's different from the 70s or 80s because not necessarily online, nothing online was done because we didn't have laptops, cell phones, or even like the internet at that time. It was only mid 90s that it became commercialized and it started to boom. And where we got the .coms coming in, people putting up their services. We take it for granted nowadays. A lot of kids take it, for granted, but there was a time where that was not the case. And people did not know what to do, how the best practices and so forth. So there was that, that's what made it up and down, of that whole process. But as you know, it's like people survived, people move on, in order